I hated my childhood. It was marred by suicidal thoughts and depression and suffering and loneliness and not fitting in. I did not realize that I was hiding the symptoms of mental illness. I just didn't want to tell my mom I was going to sex workers every night, or I was falling asleep in strip clubs, or that I was abusing drugs and alcohol.
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dear Family, the podcast. If you're listening to this the day it was published, that means it's Tuesday, November 24th, 2020. It also happens to be my next guest's birthday. Happy birthday, Gabe Howard. I hope it's really special. It's also the week of Thanksgiving, and this is a Thanksgiving we are never going to forget. And that's because we're being asked to separate from our loved ones over a holiday that we're meant to normally be surrounded by our dear family and friends. And it's really tough, I'm not going to lie. It's actually my favorite holiday and a lot of other people's favorite holidays. It's the holiday I host, and my entire family comes to my home. I look forward to it every year, so it's a little bit disappointing. But we're going to get through this. I am so focused on the good things, like the fact that we have good news about a vaccine. And next year, when we're all together and we're sitting around that table side by side, just think of how grateful we are actually going to be. So in the meantime, on Thanksgiving, count your blessings, which are abundant. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast and subscribing and writing those awesome 5-star reviews on Apple and sharing with your friends and family and telling them about this. It really means a lot, and I hope you're finding value in it. And also, thanks for those great encouraging messages I get through social media or emails. It really does mean a lot to me, and I'm glad it's touching you. Thanks so much for following me on all those platforms at Right Now Rachel. That's right with a W. Take care, everyone. Enjoy. I'm grateful for you. Gabe Howard refers to himself as a literal red-headed stepchild because he was adopted by his mom's second husband after his biological father abandoned him when he was just a baby. His childhood was fraught with depression, anxiety, mood swings, and suicidal ideation because of his yet-to-be diagnosed mental illness. In 2003, when Gabe was committed to the psychiatric hospital at 25 years old, he weighed 550 pounds. He was delusional, suicidal, and had just come off a manic phase that lasted about a year. His first wife had left him, and he'd rented an apartment to carry out his suicidal plan because, in his words, he didn't want to stigmatize the house that he owned and lower its resale value. It was in the psychiatric hospital that he finally received the proper diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Now in recovery, Gabe is a prominent mental health activist who makes mental illness less scary with his entertaining articles like Anxiety Says Everyone Hates Me and I Have Bipolar and I'm a Hypocrite. He's also a national speaker and the author of Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations. Gabe hosts 2 different podcasts, the award-winning Psych Central Podcast and another one called Not Crazy. It's a podcast that he co-hosts with his ex-wife. He's proud to be a 2017 Everyday Hero, an honor given to him in proclamation by Governor John Kasich of Ohio. Gabe makes his home in Central Ohio with his wife Kendall and a mini schnauzer he never wanted but now can't live without. Welcome. It's so nice to have you, Gabe.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
One of my first guests, his name is Andy Berman, told me about you when I first started podcasting. And I've been following you ever since. And it's such an honor to have you on my podcast. It's also such an honor to have been a guest on your podcast. You have 2 podcasts, but I was asked to come on your Psych Central Not Crazy podcast. It's out now, and it's called The Value of Personal Mental Illness Stories. And I will have a link to that specific episode, but also, of course, your amazing podcasts. I always like to start by having my guests tell me a little bit about themselves and about their family.
My name is Gabe Howard, and I live with bipolar disorder. And I want to give a quick shout out to Andy Electro Boy Berman. He's one of the first advocates that I ever met in the space. We both have bipolar disorder, and he's been very cool to me. I was really glad to make the connection. My family is complicated a little bit. I'm adopted, but my mother is my biological mother. I don't know if that qualifies me as half adopted, but my father, who I guess is technically my stepfather, except he adopted me. So does that make him my half father? And then I have a brother and a sister, which biologically they're my half brother and sister, but we never think of this that way at all. My stepfather is the only man that I've ever called dad. I consider him my father. He considers me his son. And honestly, if I wasn't 6'3" with bright red hair and he wasn't like 5'7" with dark black hair, I think we might actually all just forget. So that's my family. We're kind of a mess.
You've said this yourself, that you are literally a red-headed stepchild. I say this all the time. Family isn't based on biology. We can create our family. Do you have any kids?
No, I have a dog.
I've seen your social media and you always post about your granddaughter.
Isn't this how families are incredibly complicated? I started mentoring a little boy who was 6 years old out of the Big Brothers and Big Sisters program. And as the years progressed, he attached himself more and more to my life, or I attached myself more and more to his. And we became closer and closer and closer. And now he's 25 years old and he has a little girl who calls me grandpa. I call her my loophole granddaughter because I have managed to have grandkids without going through the suffering and frustration or expense of child rearing.
You got the best of both worlds. That makes sense because you look younger than a grandpa. Thank you for clarifying that. Your mom got pregnant very young and your biological father abandoned both of you. Did you ever get to know your biological father?
He's deceased now, and he was dying of liver cancer brought on by his own alcoholism and drug use. And I get a call that says, hey, your biological father is in hospice and he's going to die. And I said, well, I don't care. He has done nothing for me. So good riddance was my general attitude. My father said, I think that's a mistake. I think you should go talk to him. And I said, there's no point in talking to him. And my dad said, here's the deal. If you go talk to him and you get nothing out of it and there was no point, you know. If you don't go talk to him, you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering if there was something to be gleaned by talking to this man, and you can't go back. That's just how the world works. My father is not the wisest of men. I like to be clear on this. He once ordered marshmallows on pizza because he got them mixed up with mushrooms, but he was right, and I'm glad he did it. The only thing that I really gleaned from going to see my biological father was he was an asshole, and it was not a good experience, but it was an experience that I'm glad that I had. As the years have gone by, I think to myself, how secure does my father have to be in our father-son relationship bond that he's like, hey, go talk to this guy. It's no threat to me. That is probably one of the most confident actions of a person, to send their kid out into the world and be like, you're coming back. I am not a bit worried. So like I said, my dad, not a wise man, but he's pretty cool.
That was great advice. And regardless of what the outcome was, there was some closure. Did your dad leaving you ever make you feel any abandonment issues?
My biological father leaving has left huge scars in my psyche, especially with depression and bipolar disorder and suicidality. This man was supposed to love me. He created me. I'm half his genetic material. And he looked at me and he's just like, I don't care about you. Just go. I was adopted largely because he didn't want to pay child support. That's why he agreed to the whole thing. My mother has told me stories all in adulthood. Growing up, I knew none of this. My parents kept it from me. Now I'm 43 years old, so we've had adult conversations about this. But he was such a deadbeat. He ignored me. He was mean to my mom. I'm not going to like somebody that's mean to my mother. My mother's Pollyanna. She loves everybody. If you don't like my mother, I know one thing about you. It's your fault. That's just the end of it. My mom loves everybody, and she'll give you food. That's her thing. I just couldn't get over the fact that he didn't want anything to do with me. And you couple that with the symptoms of depression, suicidality, and bipolar disorder, and it's a lot.
The man that you call dad, he was an 18-wheeler semi-truck driver. He's a blue-collar worker. And you said he's not always the wisest, but in the 90s, he knew to take you to a child psychologist to get individual and family counseling. And that does seem very aware, especially back then. Hey, this was before The Sopranos. How did they know that they needed to take you to see a therapist?
I have no idea. I have been desperate to find the answer to this question my entire life. I've asked them and they were like, well, we were asking around at school because you had all of these problems. You were lying constantly. And that was sort of the crux of it. I was lying, but what concerned them is that I was lying so poorly. They would watch me do something. I would see them watch me do it and I would deny it. And I was too old for this. I was 13, 14 years old. That's toddler behavior. And this concerned them and they asked around. That's another progressive point. My parents were like, hey, we're having trouble with our kid. Anybody got any advice? It turns out that my parents are just like the most humble people I've ever met, that they can just tell strangers that they're struggling as parents. I don't know, but somebody suggested it and they weren't going to let confusion get in the way. They were going to do whatever it took. And they did it. And it worked out how it worked out. But yeah, it's so weird. The more that I hear from other people my age with similar backgrounds and how they talk about therapy, well, that head shrinker never getting a hold of my kid. Well, I'm a man. I raise my own children. Well, this is nothing the belt couldn't have resolved. And my father has said the belt thing. But the other things, he's just like, no, it's cool. I'm like, where did you come from?
Speaking of the paddling, you have said that as a child you were paddled. The therapist that you saw explained how that was a violent act and your father listened and got rid of it. Did that change anything? Was that a new awareness? Tell us about that.
From my perspective, this was the first time that I think it occurred to my parents that I could give feedback in my own upbringing. I don't know what it was like from their perspective, but from my perspective, they started taking into consideration how I viewed things and how I saw things. It's important to point out that they did not always take the therapist's advice. One time the therapist said, look, Gabe acted up, you need to take away his computer. And my parents were like, yeah, we're not doing that. He is a whiz on the computer. He's skilled at it, and we believe very strongly that he should have it. So my parents weren't blindly following the psychologist. They had interaction, for better, for worse, but I felt like I was being heard. It was also kind of nice to have this referee, because I would tell my version of the story and the therapist would be like, okay, so your dad came home, you screamed at him, and then he screamed back. Yeah, can you believe that? No, I don't understand why you would scream at your father. Wait, what? No, we need to focus on the part where he yelled at me for no reason. Well, Gabe, the reason is because you yelled at him. Look, nobody's giving my dad marks for yelling back. You have a bratty teenager at home. Count to 10, take a deep breath. These are not my father's finest moments. But until I went to the child psychologist, my version of events was I was perfect. I did nothing wrong. And my dad yelled at me for no reason. And I have nothing to contribute to that experience. And then I found out that no, I had something to contribute. And frankly, it was negative.
You showed symptoms of bipolar very young. Your mom called you Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You were always thinking about suicide, which is such a scary thing for a young person to be considering. But you were not diagnosed until you were 25. Why did it take so long for you to get diagnosed? And do you think in this day and age, you would have been diagnosed earlier?
It's certainly possible that I would have been diagnosed earlier. My father is very angry that the child psychologist did not diagnose me with bipolar disorder or any mental illness. And I understand why he's angry. My dad's like, look, I did everything I could. The problem is, of course, mental illness is complicated. There's no definitive test. I started seeing this doctor when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. There's a lot of changes. Plus, we made progress. Bipolar disorder is so difficult to diagnose because you do absolutely nothing and you'll shift into the stereotypical normal. If that happens to coincide with a therapy appointment or a punishment or a change of venue, you think that it's working. In reality, it's not. We also have to consider what we gave the child psychologist, how I acted in his presence versus what my parents or I shared with him. And that makes this extraordinarily difficult. The reason I think that I might have been diagnosed in this day and age is because there's so much more information. My parents believed all of the pop culture stuff surrounding mental illness, which means in order to consider that their son was mentally ill, they would first have to believe that they did something wrong. It was a moral value. It was an ethical value. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so that can't be the problem, right? My dad worked really, really hard, and we had dinner together as a family. We vacationed. My parents just wouldn't let me sit in my room for weeks at a time. I was forced into movie nights. I was forced into board games. I was forced into participating with the family. These are not the hallmarks of we're going to screw up our kid. These are the hallmarks of we're doing everything right, so therefore our child is not the mentally ill one. Also, my parents were like, well, he's not violent and he's smart. So there you go. There's the trifecta. I have a good mom, I'm not violent, and I'm smart. Therefore, mental illness wasn't even on the table. If my parents had available knowledge that is more easily gleaned in 2020, if they could have Googled something I was doing, it's possible they would have said to the child psychologist, Gabe literally talked for 3 hours the other day and said nothing. It was all garbled. I don't think that they ever said that. They would have said Gabe wouldn't shut up. Gabe was dominating the conversation. Gabe was attention seeking. Looking back, every time my parents said Gabe is constantly trying to be the center of attention and we can't get him to calm down, that sounds like a rambunctious teenager. But perhaps if they would have looked a little closer, they would have been like, okay, this isn't attention seeking anymore. This is racing thoughts. This is mania. This is grandiosity. And they didn't have those words or those concepts. That's why it was missed. That alone might have gotten me diagnosed.
And were you being honest with your therapist at that young age, talking about your suicidal thoughts?
Nobody ever asked me.
That would be a first question now.
I do not believe that 30 years ago, I was ever asked if I was suicidal. It's possible that my parents were, but they would have checked no. It's possible that my parents were supposed to ask me and they didn't. It's possible that my parents were supposed to ask me and did, but I forgot or lied. It's very difficult living with bipolar disorder. And where I was in the cycle, or if I was just being obstinate, we didn't have any understanding of how serious this was. And as such, did not treat it very serious at all. It's why you tell kids when they carry certain things, you need to be careful. Because if you just hand a child something and tell them to run it over to grandma, it's going to get dropped, kicked, picked up. They're not going to be careful with it because their base assumption is that mom and dad wouldn't have handed it to me if it was breakable. Our base assumption is that Gabe was fine, just needed a little help. My parents got me to adulthood, and then I started really hiding from them. There was a few things that were just coincidental. My father got transferred to Memphis, Tennessee. We were from Columbus, Ohio. I was the oldest child. So when my father got transferred, I stayed back. So this now meant that mom wasn't laying eyes on me every day. This meant that dad wasn't seeing me every day. Brother and sister weren't observing me. So all I had to do was lie. The couple of times a year that we saw each other, I just had to keep it together. And honestly, it's easy to keep it together because usually when you see your family from out of town, you're on vacation. You're hiding all of the things that you do. It's very easy to keep things together for a few days, especially when you're intentional. I did not realize that I was hiding the symptoms of mental illness. I just didn't want to tell my mom I was going to sex workers every night, or I was falling asleep in strip clubs, or that I was abusing drugs and alcohol. Those are very reasonable things. I don't think that there's anybody that wants to tell their mom when they're doing things that they know that their mom would find untoward. This is not the kind of thing you share with your mother. What'd you do last night? I went out. You don't say, oh, I went out and got drunk and plastered and had a good time. I met this woman at the bar. We went back to her house. Oh, it was great. Yeah, mom, I got laid. Nobody talks like that when that is perfectly normal behavior for a young person, when there's no mental health issues whatsoever. It's just, I don't know, we'll go with college or young adult or sowing wild oats. It's not the kind of thing you share. That allowed it to remain hidden from anybody that could have interceded on my behalf.
Once you got the diagnosis, did you share it with your parents, and did it change your relationship?
I called my mom from the psychiatric hospital as I was being admitted. How clever is this? I hated my parents and I didn't want them anywhere near me, but they were my first call when I got in trouble. I was 25 years old. If you would have asked me 2 days before, Gabe, what are your parents like? I'd have been like, oh, we don't really get along. Do you love them? I mean, yeah, you have to love your parents. I didn't really miss them all that much. I was confused by them. I hated my childhood. I hated every second of it. It was marred by suicidal thoughts and depression and suffering and loneliness and not fitting in. And I attributed that to them. It was their fault. I had a bad childhood. It must be my parents' fault. It wasn't until I got diagnosed and I got therapy that people were like, but you can hate your childhood and it not be your parents' fault. And I'm like, this is a confusing concept to me. Please explain. Well, is it possible you hated your childhood because you had an untreated mental illness? All right, that's interesting. Now, is it possible that it's not your parents' fault that you had an untreated mental illness? Okay, but wasn't it their responsibility to get me help? Okay, that's a fair statement, but isn't it possible that your parents just made a mistake and that they didn't hate you? Oh man, you're blowing my mind here. These are the things that I couldn't think about until I got that diagnosis. So I still had a really rough childhood. I didn't have a lot of friends. I felt lonely and isolated. And of course, half the time I was suicidal and I didn't have an easy go of it. But suddenly that blame got spread out among so many different things. My parents were still wrong. They wouldn't deny it if they were here. They really wish that they could have done different things. And who wouldn't? But there's a difference between being wrong and being malicious. And probably the most valuable lesson I ever learned, and probably my favorite one, is that in order to make a mistake in a relationship, you have to be present in that relationship. My parents were able to make all these mistakes because they were present in my relationship. Well, how can you hate them for that? I tried to drive them off. I did my absolute best, and they were unflappable. That's pretty amazing.
The reason why I asked you if your relationship changed is because once my mom got a bipolar diagnosis, now granted, it was not until her mid-60s, which is, can you imagine living that long without a diagnosis? We both were able to understand so much of the past better. And you and I on the Not Crazy podcast discussed this idea of revisionist history. When you're young and you're a teenager, we think our parents don't know anything. And then not until we get older can we look back with that wisdom. Tell us how you view your parents now that you've had this time and space and a diagnosis. Is there more compassion? Is there understanding for them? Do they feel the same towards you?
Forget about being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. There's so many things that I learned just by getting older. Concepts that 15, 20, 25, even 30-year-old Gabe couldn't understand. I didn't know what it was like to have a mortgage. My father was the sole breadwinner for a group of people who were utterly dependent on him for food. If my dad made one mistake and lost his job, his family had no food. I didn't understand what a burden that was on a human until I became an adult. And I still don't have children, so I don't have the full burden now. I just have a more basic understanding of what it means to have people depend on you. And I was fat. I like to eat. So, I mean, when I say that my dad had to work for food, he had to work hard. I I was a big kid, but I didn't understand that factored into his thought process. I didn't understand. My dad had a hard job. He's retired now, but sometimes he would drive all night. He'd be home for 10 hours. He'd then have to drive all night again. Sometimes he'd have to wait 30 hours before going back to work. So he was ready to go to bed and the work call came in and he's like, well, shoot, now I got to drive all night. This was the reality of his life. So when I consider why did he snap and yell at me, maybe he was just tired. Also, the older you get, the more you start doing the things your parents did. So you better revise your history. Otherwise, all the horrible things that you think about them now apply to you. So suddenly snapping at somebody and screaming, I'm like, no. It's because he was stressed. I didn't know what stress was at that age. Are you kidding? Now let's add the bipolar disorder in, Rachel. My parents, they were just outmatched, period. Bipolar disorder is mean. It's cruel, and they're trying to shape the mind of a child who has an unshapable mind. They were using logic and reason and values and ethics and skills, and none of that means anything when your brain is literally broken. I don't understand why the TV won't turn on. Look, there's nothing you can do, Dad. It's unplugged. All right? If you plug it in, you'll be fine. But we were missing that piece. They did everything they could. It was never going to work. And that's got to be incredibly frustrating. My mom was in high school when I was born. So not only was she young, but I was also the first. So it's not like she could draw on her years of experience child rearing. She was pretty young herself going through this the first time. And my dad's gone a lot. When you look at the entire picture, all of a sudden, they didn't do as bad as you once thought. I don't want anybody to think that there's not room for improvement, but I want to be forgiven for the things that I did when I was symptomatic. So it kind of stands to reason that I should probably forgive the people around me for the way that they reacted to me being symptomatic. I don't know of a book like Raising Your Bipolar Child. It may exist, but I hope it says, go to a doctor, do what they say, take meds as prescribed. Report symptoms accurately, get a lot of sleep. It doesn't tell you how to have an argument with a 14-year-old manic kid. I imagine it was extraordinarily stressful for them.
I really appreciate what you said about how you want them to forgive you, so you should have the grace to be able to forgive them. And I think that's really powerful. There's something in forgiveness, in forgiving others also frees you. Speaking of forgiveness, you've had 2 divorces and 3 marriages. Your second wife is your co-host on your podcast, Not Crazy. And I got to meet the awesome Lisa, and I loved and appreciated your banter. It was just so fun and natural. It's really cool that you can remain such great friends and be able to have this dialogue. I'm curious how your new wife feels about the fact that you guys are still friends, and tell us about her and how she deals with your bipolar.
This is a fascinating topic for folks. First and foremost, my second wife, my ex-wife, she's not my best female friend. She's my best friend.
Amazing.
That's a hard stop. And I know that there is this romantic notion that your wife is supposed to be your best friend, and that's fine. I'm not telling other people how to live your life, but my wife is above my best friend. So I don't want to demote her to best friend status. Because listen, most of us are not like sleeping with our best friends or living with our best friends or building a life with our best friends. So in my mind, wife outranks best friends. I get that a lot. Well, isn't your wife your best friend? How does she feel about not being your best friend? Positively, because she's my wife. But that might be a generational thing. But I always point that out because I get shit for it constantly, Rachel. Lisa's my best friend. She's my buddy. And we never should have gotten married. That was mistake number 1. And once again, bipolar disorder reared its ugly head. She figured out I was sick. She got me help. She was the first person to have answers that I didn't even know that I was looking for. And she got me on the track to get better. She took me to the doctor. She filled my prescriptions. She explained what was happening. She fought with the insurance companies, but she was also domino number 1. She got me to a hospital just hours before I was going to kill myself. If she was not there, there would be no Gabe. And we mistook all of that for romantic love. Because unfortunately, Americans, we don't really have a good concept of love, especially when the genders aren't the same. If Lisa would have been Tommy, I would describe Tommy, he's my family. He's my brother. He's Uncle Tommy to my dog. Because Tommy was a guy and I am heterosexual, I would have interpreted those feelings differently. I interpreted that love and that admiration and that respect romantically. And Lisa picked up on that too. We spent the first part of our marriage managing bipolar disorder. So I was subservient to her because I was sick. Well, then I got better. As I started to get better, well, now differences started to crop up. And those differences are not the kind of differences that you can have to sustain a marriage. We had different life goals. We had different ways of spending money. We had different ways of spending time. We had different things that we wanted out of a life partner, a romantic partner, from where we wanted to live to do we want to travel? Do we want to retire ever? Even how to handle the world. And that chasm got greater and greater. And then on top of that, suddenly Lisa's like, look, for the majority of our marriage, you've been subservient to me and now you think you're in charge? No, the way our marriage works is that I'm in charge and you do what I say. Well, that's excellent when somebody is sick. You ever notice that firefighters don't ask you if you want to leave the burning building? They just remove you from the burning building. But if they show up a couple of weeks later after the building is no longer on fire and the fire has been put out and you're just in your living room and drag you out of your house, now you got a problem. And that's really where we were. I'm so glad that she dragged me out of the burning building, but she never knew when to let go of that role. And that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. How we became friends, I have no idea. But it worked. The other part of your question, what does my wife think of Lisa? She loves her.
Aww,
she absolutely,
awesome.
Kendall's my wife. She is Kendall's friend independent of Gabe. Obviously, Lisa and I spend the most time together, but Kendall and Lisa have gone out and done things. Lisa likes Broadway musicals. Gabe does not. Kendall, my wife, likes Broadway musicals. Gabe does not. Lisa's husband does not like Broadway musicals either. Before COVID, Lisa and Kendall used to go to Broadway musical. This was amazing. Like, this is awesome. But they truly both enjoy this. They like going together. And they play fashion show, which is weird. They buy new clothes and try them on for each other. It's bizarre. I'm like, are you guys in high school? Men do not do this. Men do not pose and try them.
I mean, maybe some do. Why is bipolar a spectrum disorder and not just on two poles? And if you are not on one of the ends and you're right in the middle, does that mean that you're normal?
This is a hotly debated topic in the bipolar community. Obviously, bipolar disorder, it's the two poles, depression, mania, that's what the word means. So then when you're, quote, in the middle, some people would say, well, that means that you're asymptomatic. Well, if you're asymptomatic, that means you're not sick, right? Well, not exactly, but I understand why people feel that way. For me personally, I think that's dangerous thinking because the bipolar disorder is there. It's just not bothering you right now. It's kind of like if you have high blood pressure and you take high blood pressure medication and that lowers your high blood pressure. Well, does that mean you can go around and tell people that you don't have high blood pressure? Not exactly, but maybe. I sort of feel like this is a semantic argument. I try to get people away from the idea that being in the middle means that you're symptom free. Because there's other symptoms that can sort of crop up, hypersexuality, irritability, anger, rage. Of course, you can slip into depression or hypomania or be on your way towards something. Grandiose thinking can pop up at any time. But if people are like, oh, well, are you depressed? No. Are you manic? No. Then you're symptom free. Yay! And you believe this, then the fact that you're having these other symptoms, you don't count because you believe that there's only two symptoms. Obviously, if you are right in the middle, the stereotypical normal part, and you're having zero symptoms, I agree. You are in fact symptom free. But I got to tell you, it's that kind of thinking that lets a symptom sneak in that you're not expecting or looking for, and it can just do an awful lot of damage when you're not expecting it to happen.
That's typically when people go off meds, right? Because they think that everything is smooth. I don't even know where this falls in the polls. There's something called a mixed state. Sadly, that's often when people feel suicidal because if they're incredibly depressed, they might not even be able to make a plan. If they're incredibly manic, they're feeling potentially, I will say, good. But if you're in a mixed state, there's that chance of actually following through with the plan. Have you ever been in a mixed state?
I have been in a mixed state. It's kind of like being wet and dry at the same time. The closest that I can ever come to maybe what a mixed state feels like is, have you ever been in a hot tub in the snow? You're sitting in the hot tub and you feel all warm and cozy because you're in that hot tub and there's that steam. It's 102 degrees, but it's 0 degrees outside. It's snowing outside. If you reach your arms out and put them on the side, that's out of the water. That's out of the steam zone. So all of a sudden you just put your arms on ice cubes. You're like, ah! And you're like, how can I be this warm and this cold at the same time? And it doesn't match. You feel so toasty and yet there's snow. You're looking at snow. You can see the snow. Sometimes the wind does push through. It's a very unique experience. Here's the difference. With a mixed state, you don't know what's going on. You don't know why it doesn't match. When you get in the hot tub in the snow, you know what you're getting into. You know what you're doing. It's part of the fun. But when it's incongruent like that, when something looks hot but it's cold, it confuses you. And the more you try to wrap your mind around it, the more confused you get. And when you're feeling happy and sad at the exact same time, it's bad enough that you're not in control, but you just have no explanation at this point. And when I say you have no explanation, I don't mean to other people. You can't explain what you're going through to yourself. And that makes you wildly unpredictable, wildly out of control, and wildly dangerous to yourself in so many ways. Obviously, suicide being a top one. Let's say that you decide to drive in that position, or you decide to go online shopping and blow your rent money, and then you get evicted. Let's say that's the time that your parents come over to talk about why you've been so distant. That can turn out all kinds of horrible in so many ways other than suicide. Obviously, death is unequivocally the worst possible outcome because you can't explain that to your parents later. You can't borrow money to pay your rent, but it's utterly unpredictable, and it lacks an understanding that is just so necessary to being able to cope and exist.
Sounds exhausting, honestly. What are some things that bipolar people should do, and what are some things bipolar people should not do?
It's tough because I want to say, listen, here's something that people with bipolar disorder should not do. They should not drink and they should not do drugs. Yeah, my email box is going to fill up so quick. There's 3 billion people in the world. There's tens of millions of people with bipolar disorder. Trust me, Rachel, there's somebody that is absolutely fine drinking a glass of wine and it's not bothering them at all. But in general, these are some really big things to avoid, especially if you're on medication. Bipolar disorder really needs to be controlled with medication. I talk to a lot of people and they're like, well, I'm controlling it with diet and exercise. And I really want to follow up with them in 10 years and see how that worked out for them. Everybody that is using yoga to manage bipolar disorder makes the YouTube video, but nobody's around to take it down when the crisis hits. And maybe they don't take it down because they're embarrassed, or maybe they do take it down, but 100,000 people have already seen it. And when they make the, hey, look, I was wrong, it turns out that yoga can't cure major medical disorders much in the way that I thought, that one doesn't go viral. The one that went viral is the how yoga saved bipolar disorder. And I don't need big pharma because they're evil. The pharmaceutical companies have some issues. I don't know if I'd call them evil, but I certainly wouldn't call them magnanimous. It's difficult to figure out what not to do and what to do. But I got to tell you, one of the things that you absolutely should do is learn everything you can about your illness and manage it and keep on top of it and never, ever turn your back on it. Every single person that's like, oh, I'm fine, I don't worry about it anymore. I'm like, it's going to get you. It might not be today.
It's something that you have to manage for the rest of your life. And it's manageable, but you can't look away. It's something to deal with. You wrote a book called Mental Illness is an Asshole. I absolutely love that title. Tell us about the book and about the title.
The book is a collection of articles that I wrote over a 5-year period, and it covers everything from the basics, what is bipolar disorder, to articles like Anxiety Says Everyone Hates Me, I Have Bipolar Disorder and I'm a Hypocrite. It talks about families. There's a series of articles that I wrote every day on my birthday for 5 years, and it's this hodgepodge of meanderings and well-researched articles and opinions and suggestions all about living with mental illness. And there is an article in there that I wrote called Mental Illness is an Asshole. The internet is a very complicated place to write for. And every now and again, things go viral. And whenever something goes viral, well, people like me, we try to copy it. For this very small period of time back in like 2016, something is an asshole was a very trending topic. 3-year-olds are assholes was popular. Editors are assholes. Parents are assholes. Children are assholes. Working's an ass. And you're thinking, my God, this was, but yeah, we all used to dump cold water on our heads for a summer. So it's not so hard to believe that that would trend. I thought, well, I want to get in on this. So I wrote an article called Mental Illness is an Asshole. Now, I never intended to have a book named that. In fact, when the publisher was like, we're going to name the book Mental Illness is an Asshole, I was like, that's not a good idea. Like, my grandma's not going to like that. They were like, well, your grandma doesn't work here, so that's what we're naming it. Spoiler alert, my grandma doesn't care. She loves it. She carries the book around. What I am most proud of in the entire book is that there is literally something in there that everybody will love, and there is literally something in there that will piss everybody off. So if you buy my book, you will find the thing that you love, and you will find the thing that will piss you off. And I think that's beautiful, because the reality is, if you're reading something and you only agree with it, there's no opportunity for growth there. And if you're reading something and you disagree with everything, you're probably going to stop reading or not pay attention to it, or it's going to be too far outside of your comfort zone. I think the back and forth outside of the lines makes people consider things, and I want you to disagree with me. So when you do, just know that's excellent, because I've taught you accidentally, and it's been an accident, make no mistake, Rachel, I've taught you accidentally how to apply some very difficult concepts to your own life and decide where they fit in managing your mental illness or loving somebody with a mental illness. And that's what we want, because not everybody's Gabe, and not everybody's Gabe's parents.
I will have a link in the show notes to your book. Gabe, you host 2 different podcasts on Psych Central. The first is the Psych Central Podcast show, and another one that used to be called A Bipolar, a Schizo, and a Podcast is now called Not Crazy. Tell us about them, and how are they different?
The Psych Central Podcast is the flagship. It's the first podcast I ever started. And the goal of that was to bring mental illness, mental health, and psychology from experts down to the level of a layperson. What I always think as I'm interviewing experts is, will my father understand this? Because at one point, my dad is just minding his own business. His son gets diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he needed information that was reliable and that he could trust. But here's the kicker: that he could understand. And he had trouble finding it because doctors don't always speak in ways that we can understand. I love this podcast so much because I've talked to some of the most incredible people, cutting edge researchers, doctors, therapists on a wide variety of topics, knowing that pretty much anybody can get the information. That makes me very, very excited. Now we go over to Not Crazy and A Bipolar, a Schizophrenic, and a Podcast. What happened was I was interviewing all of these experts, and I'm what's considered a patient advocate. I live with bipolar disorder, so I'm a mental health advocate by way of the fact that I have mental illness. That's not exactly an expert. That's not a doctor, a researcher, a therapist. There's no letters after my name. And as the show got bigger and bigger and bigger, I was having trouble finding a space for lived experience. And I didn't like that. I don't want the patient voice to be removed. This would be like you doing an episode that has nothing to do with family. You're like, hey, this week on Dear Family, we're going to talk about my opinion of the upcoming college football season. That's like, you may be well passionate about it, but everybody's like, look, we tuned in to listen about families. What are you doing to me here? So I started another podcast that only focuses on the lived experience voice, that only focuses on what people like me, people who live with mental illness, think, how we see the world, the controversies, the pop culture. It's great to have people with lived experience on talk about what's going on, because so often we're told what we're thinking about. Hi, my name is Dr. Bob, and people with bipolar disorder often fear X. Well, I'd like to have, hi, my name is Bob. I live with bipolar disorder and I fear X. And that's how that show was launched. When we switched co-hosts, we switched up the name because the new co-host did not have schizophrenia. And that's pretty much the end of that story. They're great shows. They fill 2 completely different niches, and a lot of people listen to both, but they're awesome. I am biased, but I do believe I do a good job.
You do a great job, and you also have a great voice. So I call myself a mental health advocate using the platform to rid stigma and tell stories, rid shame, and find compassion and love. But it's just a recent title, and it's about 2 years old. You, on the other hand, are one of the original pioneers in this field, and you are a public speaker, and you've received recognition and awards for educating the masses. So why do you feel that it's so important to be a public face for bipolar disorder, and have things changed since your first public discussion?
I'm very fond of saying that this all happened accidentally, because it did. People ask me all the time, well, what was your plan? I don't know. Well, what did you want to do? Change the world? Well, how did you go about doing it? I don't know. I just started doing stuff. And to this day, 15 years later, every time I give a speech or give an interview, I just always assume that's going to be the last one. I really just have this general mentality that I'll just go away as quickly as it came, as quickly as it will go away. It hasn't yet. Maybe this is part of my anxiety or just my general low self-esteem, but I didn't really have a plan. I'm lucky enough to have a family that doesn't care about me being open, that doesn't care about me talking about them, about pointing out their mistakes. So many people can't talk openly about living with mental illness because their family says, don't air the family's dirty laundry. You're hurting your mother. Well, you can't say that. Your father worked so hard. How dare you say that he made a mistake? Is that how you repay us for, I don't know, braces? My family was like, we don't care. Say whatever you want. And I did. And I do. And holidays aren't awkward, so I guess I'll keep doing it. As far as how things are changing, this is tough. In some areas, it's changed quite a bit. More people are openly talking about living with mental illness than ever before. We see celebrities talking about it. It's great. After 15 years of working my ass off, some celebrity has an anxiety disorder, and now they get $25,000 to give the speech that I used to get paid to do. But, whatever, I'm not bitter. But it is good. It's bad for business, but it's good for the cause. So that's changed a lot. But you know what hasn't changed? Access to care. It hasn't changed at all. There's not less homeless people than there was 15 years ago. There's not less mass incarceration of people with mental illness than there was 15 years ago. There's not less suicides than there was 15 years ago. I still run into people that can't get access to care. They're desperate for help, but they can't get it. They don't have insurance. They don't have advocates. There are not resources in their town. Their state doesn't appreciate it.
That's why you and I need to continue speaking about this, because our mental health is just as important as our physical health. And we need to make sure politicians and educators and everyone that is looking out for others' well-being know that, because we cannot forget. And I so appreciate you talking about the homeless and the incarcerated, because it's getting worse. All right, Gabe, last two questions I ask all my guests. Where were you when you were 20 years old?
I was married to my first wife, and I had just bought a house in Dublin, Ohio, trying to figure out what to do with my first house. It was overwhelming and awesome all at the same time. This is another reason that nobody thought I was sick. Like, that was the bragging point, right? Well, Gabe bought a house. How old was he? He was 19 and he's married. And oh my God, your son is so amazing. Yet none of that screams, your son is really sick. You should probably get him checked. Right. It all seemed like an uptick. These are things that mask the symptoms of mental illness, especially to those who don't understand.
There's so many people that deal with bipolar that are so highly intelligent, and it's often during those manic episodes that you have massive bursts of creativity or energy or productivity. If you could write your younger 20-year-old self a Dear Gabe love letter, knowing what you know now in your 40s, what would you have told yourself?
Buy Amazon.com stock. That's I suspect that's probably not the answer that you're looking for.
I love that answer.
But that would be the answer. I could have gotten diagnosed 5 years sooner. Like, I want to be like, dude, you have bipolar disorder. Feeling suicidal every day is abnormal. These outbursts that you have, these ideas that you have, the paranoia that you have, none of this is you. I would have done 5 years less damage. If I told myself that, though, I would still say, find Lisa. Trust me on this one. Just find her. And I don't know if I would have listened to either one, but they're so intrinsically linked that if I could get a letter to my 20-year-old self, I don't know that I'd do it, because you can't gain one without losing something else. Lisa and I play this game all the time because they did this in Star Trek, and Lisa's a huge Trekkie. The thing that the guy fixed, it ruined everything for him, even though he had considered it the worst thing that he ever did and his biggest regret. Because that didn't happen, he lost everything.
You're the first person that said that to me, and I really do like that answer, because it's often the most painful things in our life that bring us the biggest lessons. It's those failures, it's those hard moments that we rise to, that we are grateful for. Last question, Gabe. What brings you happiness? What are your happiness habits?
I have terrible happiness habits. I want to be the first one to admit that I am not good at looking on the bright side, and it's definitely an area that I work on a lot in therapy. I'm very good at getting angry at the glass. Like, it's not half full or half empty. It's just in my way and I'm annoyed by it. And do I have to wash it? Like, who left the glass here? That's just how my mind works. Like, well,
You're
what
not
is
an optimist.
I am not an optimist. I am very, very, very much a pessimist, but I'm also very much a realist, which has been pointed out to me as just a cover for, being an asshole. I find joy in other people, and I love words. There's an expression that I say to my wife a lot. I say, I love you more than words, and you know how much I love words. I really feel strongly that the answer to all of our problems is contained in words. So we already have the answer. Just nobody's strung together the words yet. And I just keep watching people, hoping that somebody will do something that shows me that this is not pointless. And I don't always find it, but it's there a lot more than I give it credit for. Plus, people are fascinating to watch, especially when they don't know they're being watched. I wish that I could capture it some way in what I see other people do. It's uniquely beautiful, and it's never something that's going to be in a television show or a movie. You just have to be in the moment when it happens. And I get to steal those moments with other people, and they don't even know it.
You were saying growing up how you struggled and had a hard time with friends that may have made you very observant in other people's behaviors, and that you're able to find it so fascinating, and just that you're aware. Because a lot of people aren't. They're so self-absorbed that they only look within. I would say, just from watching your social media, that you would probably add Diet Coke and your dog.
Without Diet Coke, Gabe does not run. I mean, it's basically batteries for me, or gasoline. Every now and again, I can't find Diet Coke and nothing good happens.
Oh, goodness. How many Diet Cokes do you have a day?
You know the 32 ounce they have at McDonald's? I probably have about 30 of those a day. Yeah, that's. I think I'm exaggerating, and I'm not exaggerating.
Well, after seeing your social media, which I will also have a link to, people will agree that that's probably how much you are drinking. Well, Gabe, this has been awesome. I'm so grateful that you've come on Dear Family, and I'm grateful that we now can call each other friends. And I look forward to eventually one of these days. Will you ever come out to LA, you think?
Yeah, I used to travel all the time.
I know. Well, when the pandemic is over. Okay. Well, when the pandemic is over, we're going to hang out. When you come and give one of your big talks, I will be there in the front row, and we'll go grab a Diet Coke.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
All right. Goodbye, Gabe. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, Dear Family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.